Hey, what's going on, people? It's Rosie here, and today I have something great for you. We are about to embark on a thorough investigation into the lore surrounding Archmagus Shalidor. According to legend, he somehow created the College of Winterhold with a whispered spell. He also constructed the great maze known as the Labyrinth in the ruins of Bromjunaar, and supposedly it guards the fabled secret of life known as Glamoril, which Shalidor somehow stole from Akatosh. And despite all these achievements, he endlessly sought to extend his own lifespan so that he might achieve more. And we know he succeeded in buying himself some time, but how exactly he lived so long remains a mystery. We know a lot about this character, but there's so much more that we don't know. Why was he constantly running off to Labyrinthian? How did he manage to write so much on such a wide array of subjects in his lifetime? Where did his house, the Fortress of Ice, come from, and where did it go? How and why did he build the College of Winterhold and the Labyrinth? Last but certainly not least, what is Glamoril? What is this secret of life that the Labyrinth guards? I've done months of research in all this, and I'm happy to tell you that I have answers that I'm confident in for every one of those questions. All of Shalidor's deepest, darkest secrets are about to be revealed. I'm also very pleased to announce that the one and only EpicNate is joining us on this adventure, and I'm going to hand the mic off to him in just a moment. First, hello and welcome everyone. If you're new here, thank you so much for checking me out. If you like Elder Scrolls and Fallout Theory kind of content, then you're in the right place. I started this channel a few years ago, and after some moderate success, I decided, you know what, I'm going to give this my all, and I'm to see if I can get it to a place where it can be my career. And I haven't given up yet, but if it doesn't get there within the next few months, I am going to start looking for another job. If it comes to that, I'm sorry. I really want this to work out, but I also want to find the woman of my dreams and have children, but right now this job is preventing me from doing that. But right now my priority is delivering great content for you. And I'm so excited for you guys to finally see this. I think this is my best work yet. So here's my proposition to you. Enjoy the video, and at the end, if you think I've earned it, subscribe and share. And if you have something to add or like a critique or something, then let me know in the comments. So without further ado, here's the EpicNate. Thank you so much for joining me, Nate. It's an honor and privilege to work with you.
You're very welcome, Rosie. Happy to be here, you're a terrific YouTuber, and it is a shame more people don't know about you. Now, let's unveil the lost secrets of Archmagus Shalidor. This character can actually be traced back to the Elder Scrolls Arena. That's right, the OG regime of Julian Lefay, Vijay Loxman, and Ted Peterson had Shalidor in their lore back in 1994. He came up sometimes in the following years. Then, the Todd Howard regime decided to take the series to Skyrim, Shalidor's home province. So, they of course expanded upon the character quite a lot. Then, shortly after, ZeniMax made him an actual walking, talking NPC for one of their faction questlines going into ESO. So, in light of all this history, it's important that we understand the exact vision for Shalidor has evolved several times throughout the Elder Scrolls games. Bethesda was not the developer we know it as now back in 1994, and the gaming industry itself was very different back then. For instance, writing in video games was stylistically different when the industry was that young. Ted Peterson sometimes talks about how we debate the pronunciation of words he made up, like Sayesi. And he says back in the day, before there was voice acting in the games, the exact pronunciation of these words was never even on his radar. He was thinking about how they looked on the screen. So, to uncover Shalidor's secrets, we need to keep in mind that the exact vision for this character has been expanded upon throughout the development of the Elder Scrolls. Not everything there is about him now can be traced back to Arena. But it does appear that the various developers that have explored Shalidor have remained true to the important aspects of what Ted Peterson wrote. So, let's cover some background that will be relevant throughout our investigation. In Arena, Shalidor's history is explored when the Eternal Champion must recover the second piece of the Staff of Chaos. Here's what Rhea Silmain tells us. Quote, "There was once a great maze, built by the Archmagus Shalidor to guard what he called Glamoril, the elven term for secret of life. I know not the location of the great maze, which was called the Labyrinthian, but somewhere in its twisted corridors lies the second piece of the Staff of Chaos. Shalidor, according to the old text, made his home in the Fortress of Ice. He would not have built the Labyrinthian far from his home. Unquote. This would take us to the Winterhold Mages Guild, where they'd send us to the Fortress of Ice to recover an artifact they would use to locate Labyrinthian. Once there, the player would be presented with a little story about two brothers who failed to find the secret of life, named Canaan the Elder and Morgrus the Dim. We'd then have to find wraiths of these two brothers and answer a riddle. Morgrus's riddle is, quote, more beautiful than the face of your god, yet more wicked than a daemon's forked tongue. Dead men eat it all the time. Live men who eat it die slow. Unquote. The answer is nothing. Canaan actually claims to hold the secret of life, despite having apparently failed it when he attempted the maze. His riddle is, quote, two bodies have I, through both joined in one. The more still I stand, the quicker I run. The answer is hourglass. That's all the important info from Arena. Now, let's talk about how the Skyrim team expanded upon this. Firstly, they made the actual maze an hourglass, suggesting that the answer to the second riddle is part of the vision. And based on that, we should also consider that other parts of the physical Labyrinthian may represent aspects of that vision as well. Rosie came up with a few possible lore explanations for the changes, but we're just going to cover the one that adds up the best. Maybe part of the reason they made the ruins of Labyrinthian so big was to create space where the arena quest could have taken place besides the maze. There exists this location in here called Lost Valkig that has no apparent purpose. So maybe it only exists so that it can be assumed that it's where the Eternal Champion found the brothers. It's worth noting that the dungeon in Arena had 2 levels, and Lost Valkig is designed in such a way that it gives an upper and lower level. So maybe Jagar Tharn, the 2 brothers, and the Eternal Champion all somehow went to the wrong place. Perhaps they all had directions that assumed they were entering from the south, but they all actually entered from the north. I mean, if you had something that said, like, enter the ruins, then follow the edge east until you find the door, coming from the south takes you to the maze, and likewise, the north takes you to the Lost Valkig. After all, a minor maze states that, quote, while navigating the destroyed city itself was not explicitly a part of the test, many candidates did not survive the journey. Shalidor valued both academic knowledge as well as practical skill, and simply getting to the labyrinth required the latter. So actually, getting to the test was sort of this unofficial part of it. Like how when you take tests in school, you have to show up, and apparently many candidates failed to reach the maze. So, perhaps the brothers and Tharn simply went to the wrong place, but ultimately, this is just a likely lore-friendly explanation for a more serious retcon.
The Morrowind through Skyrim era also expanded upon Shalidor's lore quite a lot. What was the Winterhold Mages Guild in Arena has since become the College of Winterhold, which according to legend was built by Shalidor. A minor maze actually says there are some tales of him building the whole city of Winterhold with a whispered spell. This could suggest that he achieved the second walking way, the Sigic Endeavor. If you want a more detailed breakdown on this subject, well, I've got it, and you should check it out next. But here's a crash course of what you need to know for now. The walking ways were first introduced in Morrowind's lore, and what they are is they're these paths to transcendence, and completing them unlocks new powers within the Elder Scrolls universe. This specific one, the Sigic Endeavor, grants the walker a limited ability to create within the Elder Scrolls universe. As Mankar Cameron puts it in the Mythic Dawn commentaries, it's how mortals become makers. So this is a potential explanation as to how Shalidor could have created the college with some sort of spell. And it becomes more likely when we consider that we do know he was capable of creating pocket realms, which are these little realms of existence within the Elder Scrolls universe that can have their own metaphysical rules, at least to some extent. 2 well-known pocket realms are the Clockwork City, made by Sophisil and possibly Amalexia as well, and the Soulcairn, made by the Ideal Masters. So how do we know that Shalidor could make these? Well, because in ESO, there's this place called the Shrouded Realm, and its loading screen reads, before working arcane miracles on Ivea and the College of Winterhold, the great mage Shalidor experimented with pocket realms of Oblivion. So yeah, this confirms that Shalidor could indeed make pocket realms, and I do not believe this is a retcon. I believe this was true as of Skyrim as well, and just was not confirmed. And the notion that the Psijic endeavor is in fact what enables one to create pocket realms is very strong. I won't go over all the details now, but think about some of the characters that we talked about, like Sophisil, Almalexia, Mankar Cameron. Those characters all have very strong ties to the Walking Ways. So yes, I believe that Shalidor did in fact clear the Psijic endeavor, and possibly more Walking Ways as well, which we'll keep building upon throughout the video. As I'm sure you know, Shalidor was the first Archmage of the college, but he divided his time between there, his home the Fortress of Ice, Labyrinthian, and the ESO added Ivea to the equation as well. But Bethesda's intention during the Elder Scrolls V era seems to have been that he spent most of his time in Northern Skyrim. If we look at the lore that was around at that time though, we know that there were times that he did travel to other provinces like Hammerfell, but his main stomping ground seemed to have been the stretch of Skyrim that runs from the college to Labyrinthian. And according to Urag, he was constantly on the go throughout this region. Yet somehow, despite all that traveling, he found time to write an enormous number of volumes on a plethora of different subjects. He was in fact so prolific that Urag finds it suspicious. How did Shalidor find time to learn about so many different things and write so much about them? Well, this is a hint that Shalidor had a way of cheating time. I won't spoil what exactly his little exploit was right now, but something we should establish now is that the precise vision for this appears to have changed from Skyrim to ESO. The Skyrim team's intention seems to have been that he had one method of cheating time, but was always looking for more. And the ESO team seems to have expanded this into that he did eventually find some more. But nevertheless, this appears to be a retcon. I do not believe these additional methods were part of the Skyrim team's vision, because it's just inconsistent with my findings from that game. And I know when people hear the term retcon, they go, oh no, but this one's alright. I hesitate to say that I agree with making it, but I see why the ESO team did this. I see the artistic appeal of making this change, because it does sort of suit the theme of Shalidor's story a bit better. So when I bring all this full circle in the Glamoril chapter, please just listen with an open mind. Don't let the term retcon aggravate you. Just think about how it suits the story. Another obscure detail about Shalidor that comes up sometimes in heavy lore discussions about him is he seems to have been able to see into the future, at least to some extent. This power comes up a lot in the Elder Scrolls universe, and it goes by a few names, but let's stick to calling it Farsight for consistency. Some characters besides Shalidor that have it off the top of my head are, let's see, Olava the Feeble, Degale, Vivek, and of course Emperor Uriel VII. So how does Farsight work? It involves something called the Dreamsleeve, which Nate recently explored in his investigation into Mayik the Liar. Kirkbride explained it pretty well back in an old forum thread called Made Up Word Roundup. Dreamsleeve, stolen from a neat word Ken made up for Battlespire, the Dreamsleeve is a conduit for sending special transmissions, used by weirdo magicians and Imperial clerks mainly. Kinda like MySpace, only to reach it one must have at least one part of their brain constantly meditating. Because one aspect of the conduit is that it is able to carry images of concepts not yet real. So via the Dreamsleeve, Farsight can grant visions, glimpses of the future, and possibly even glimpses outside of the Elder Scrolls universe. As some fans have pointed out, the parts of Shalidor's insights read like maybe they're from development documents. So how do we know that Shalidor had Farsight? Well, I just kinda said it, didn't I? We know based on the contents of his insights. Most of what's in here is just indecipherable, but fans have managed to put some of it together. This paragraph is the Alduin excerpt from Varieties of Faith in the Empire, and this one is from the story of Old Knocker in 5 Songs of King Wulfarth. So what's peculiar about this? Well, this edition of Varieties of Faith in the Empire was written long after Shalidor's lifetime. It describes several versions of the god Talos, who did not exist until the late Second Era. There is an older version of the book with a similar passage in Alduin, but Shalidor has the post-Talos version of it written here. See how he cites the 9 divines, not the 8 divines? 5 Songs of King Wulfarth tells a tale about the Battle of Red Mountain that occurred in the First Era, year 700. So this book must have been written after that date, but we're not sure of exactly how long after. though it does portray these events like they're myths from a bygone era, not recent occurrences. So I feel comfortable assuming that it was written after Shalidor's lifetime, but it doesn't matter because we know that Varieties of Faith in the Empire was. Yet, somehow, he's jotted down sections of these books in his journals that he wrote back in the early First Era. The only explanation I can come up with for that is that he used Farsight to see these sources in the future and wrote parts of them down. This also makes sense of why they end so abruptly mid-sentence and why his handwriting is so rushed. Farseeing is limited, as we see with characters like Olava the Feeble. So I think Bethesda's idea here is that Shalidor would see into the future and literally look over the shoulders of people reading books. Then he'd try to write down as much as he could, as fast as he could, before they turned the page or before the vision ended. There's also his little drawings to be considered. These are probably, as Kirkbride put it, images of concepts not yet real. So they're things that he's seeing from, from the future. They could just be like visions, or maybe he's seeing, stuff on the Bethesda Studio computers. In addition to the copy of Shalidor's Insights that's actually in the vanilla game, there are actually 5 unused pages. So we always need to be careful when it comes to cut content, but in this case we should examine it because a lot of what's in these unused pages is consistent with themes explored in this video. Most of the actual text in these is either a made script, some other chicken scratch, or otherwise just indecipherable. He's also drawn more pictures. So this is probably more information that he got from the Dreamsleeve. On this page he's once again written down part of Old Knocker, and he's drawn Wolfarv's pyre from that story. So this seems to be something that Shalidor looks to the Dreamsleeve for information on frequently, but why? Well, there's a part of the story that Shalidor almost finished writing down on one of these pages, where Wolfarv learns a shout called, "What happens when you shake the dragon just so?" which he used to extend his people's lifespans back to normal after Alduin had shortened them. A shout that can extend lifespans. Now that's something that Shalidor would have an interest in, wouldn't he? But this raises the question, could Shalidor shout? In light of all my research, I'm pretty sure that the answer is yes. There's just too many instances in which it makes sense to be a coincidence. So I'll break each one down as they come up. And yeah, this is the first one. The likely reason Shalidor was so obsessed with Old Knocker was because he wanted to learn what happens when you shake the dragon just so, hoping that he could use it to extend his own lifespan. Perhaps he was hoping that the words of power would be written in the story, or that there'd at least be information on where he could get the words of power. After all, it's not like he could ask Wolfarv, because this was probably before he was even born, and this would predate the Greybeards by hundreds of years. In addition to Old Knocker, Shalidor also seems to have had a lot of interest in the Dragon Cult, and specifically Alduin. But why? Well, Alduin is the Outmoran dragon god, so he oversees time in that pantheon. So maybe Shalidor thought that studying Alduin could lead him to more ways of extending life. Also, Akatosh, who Shalidor allegedly stole Glamoril from, is the Alessian dragon god. So we should consider that maybe we've got a mistranslation here, and Shalidor actually quote-unquote stole Glamoril from Alduin. Now let's discuss how ESO expanded upon Shalidor. ZeniMax focused a lot more on Shalidor as a character than the previous games did. For the Mages Guild questline in that game, Shalidor returns to Mundus as a Shade to reclaim an island called Ivea that he lost to Sheogorath in a bargain that went badly for him. We get a few glimpses into Shalidor's life throughout the questline through things like dialogue, journals, and these displays made by Sheogorath. He was married to a woman named Ulfsild who is half Nord and half Reachman. However, she sadly left him because his obsession with reclaiming Ivea took a big toll on their marriage. But that may not have been the end for them. Next up, like we touched on before, ZeniMax doubled down on Shalidor having achieved the Psijic endeavor, since the Shrouded Realm confirms that he indeed was capable of creating pocket realms. It's also confirmed that Shalidor had an unnaturally long lifespan, which really is hinted at in Skyrim but is confirmed in ESO. But remember, this is an area where there seem to have been retcons. So there are plenty of ways to extend life in Elder Scrolls, and Shalidor's dialogue at the end of ESO's Mages Guild line tells us that one of his methods involved rituals of some kind. My guess is that ZeniMax added these rituals to the equation to better suit the story that they wanted to tell about Shalidor. We'll discuss how this works a little better for them than what the Skyrim team was going for really does after I've explained the theory. ZeniMax also expanded the scope of Shalidor's frequent travels as far as the Somerset Archipelago. That's where Ivea is located, which was given to him by the Altmer in exchange for some baubles that he didn't think much of. And again, my belief is that ZeniMax added this new place where Shalidor went frequently because it opened them up to tell new stories about him. Alright, so that's a rundown of Shalidor's history throughout Elder Scrolls lore since the 90s. So one thing that really stood out to me in my research is there is nothing about Shalidor prior to him being an exceptional mage. The earliest account of him seems to be this loose claim that he explored Nordic ruins as a youth, but he may have already been a talented mage at that point. We also know that he had ways of extending his life, yet he did die. So, what happened? Did the effect of these methods simply run out? Did someone kill him? What changed? It's all about to be revealed. What happens to the Fortress of Ice he used as a home, and why did he live there to begin with? What in Labyrinthium was he so drawn to that he kept going back? How did he manage to write so much despite traveling all the time? How did he create the College of Winterhold, and what was its original purpose? And of course, what is Glamoril? What is this fabled secret of life that the Labyrinth supposedly guards? I have answers for all those questions, and I'm so excited to finally share them with you. Let's begin with the Fortress of Ice. According to Rhea Silmane's dialogue in Arena, this was Shalidor's home, and the main questline of Elder Scrolls 1 would eventually take us there. It was in Skyrim, not far from Winterhold. But there is no such place in the Elder Scrolls 5. You can search the glaciers all you want, but you will not find Shalidor's Fortress of Ice anywhere. However, there is something right on the spot where it was on Arena's map, the ruins of Saarfall, the place where we discovered the Eye of Magnus in Skyrim's College of Winterhold questline. We know that Saarfall dates back to the Malefic era, yet it seems that somehow this Fortress of Ice was here in the Third era. So what's going on here? Well, if we put some thought into it, we can figure it out. Just after starting this questline, Tolfdir says the college has been excavating Saarfall, but doesn't say how long this has been going on. Now let's look around the exterior of Saarfall. It's built in this crater between the glaciers. Also, the actual catacombs that we excavate are down here, yet there's scaffolding up here. Now this certainly wasn't built by the ancient Nords. So, the likely explanation here is that the Fortress of Ice was right where it's supposed to be, right here on top of Saarfall, and the college dug it up to get to the ruins. This also makes sense when we consider that another one of the college's ongoing agendas is learning everything they can about Shalidor. They probably excavated the Fortress of Ice because it was his home, and they likely discovered that Saarfall was beneath it by poking around in there. Then when they got all the information they could from the fortress, they dug it up to get to the catacombs. But we still have a problem. You don't build cities under glaciers. Clearly, the Fortress of Ice wasn't here when the Atmorans built Saarfall, yet it was during Shalidor's lifetime in the First Era and during the events of Arena in the Third Era, and now in the Fourth Era it's gone because the college dug it up. So how could the Fortress of Ice have been here in the middle of that timeline? Well, glaciers move, so we could speculate that maybe one slid into place above Saarfall, then moved again, but the thing is, glaciers obliterate everything in their paths. The ruins are just too well preserved for that explanation. So how did the Fortress of Ice come to be? Well, there's a line of Shalidor's dialogue from ESO that can help us. What are you most proud of? Ha, you might as well ask a parent which is their favorite child. So many of my little projects became legend. Ivea, Labyrinthian, the Great Ice Fortress of Winterhold, and Glamoril, of course, but I do go on. He refers to the Fortress of Ice as a project of his, so he seems to be implying that he created it. But how and why? Let's start with the how. Honestly, I think it's feasible that he did simply use his command of magic to do it. We know that what's possible to do with magic in this universe goes well beyond what we're actually able to do with it in the games. There are several spell effects in prior games that aren't in Skyrim, and likewise there are spell effects in Skyrim that weren't in prior games, but when it comes to any spells in or not in any given game, we don't question that they all exist within the context of the lore. And there are plenty of amazing magical feats we can read about, like say the drummer creating the Midium, that we of course cannot actually do in the games. The reason that magic has the limits that it has when we're playing is because that's how creation works. That's the way it needs to be from a development standpoint, and you know, there's a beauty to that. Any spell or magical effects that's actually usable in the games is something that Bethesda or modders have to create. So just because no one's ever actually made it so you can use frost magic or maybe some alteration spell to create a big fortress of ice doesn't mean we shouldn't assume that it's possible within the context of the lore. However, I do have another idea as to how Shalidor might have done this that's a little more specific. Players tend not to spend much time in the final stretch of Saarfall because Tolfdir makes us feel rushed to get back to the college. But there's a detail in here that may be relevant. The word wall is for ice form. So a word for ice form was buried right beneath the Fortress of Ice. And this is the second reason why I'm fairly certain that Shalidor was capable of shouting. The likely reason that he was so obsessed with Old Knocker is because he was hoping to learn the shout that Wolfarth learned in that story. And now it's looking like maybe whatever magics he used to create the Fortress of Ice involved the ice form shout. Let's think about where Shalidor spent a lot of his time. The ESO team seems to have adjusted what the Skyrim team intended a little bit here. Zenimax seems to have decided that he traveled all over Tamriel all the time, but the Skyrim team's intent seems to have been that while he did go outside of Skyrim sometimes, he spent most of his time in Northern Skyrim. And if you want a lore-friendly explanation for that, then maybe back when he had Ivea, he frequented the Somerset Isle, and, he traveled around with Ulfsild. But then when he lost Ivea and Ulfsild, he kind of lost the need to go anywhere, so he just spent most of his time in Skyrim. So let's get more specific here. As of the Elder Scrolls V, as of what those developers were envisioning here, what specific locations did Shalidor frequent? He was Archmage here at the college, he lived on top of Saarfall, and he built the Labyrinth here at Bromjunaar. So yeah, the man was very familiar with Northern Skyrim. And guess where the other words for ice form are? Here at Mount Anthor, and here at Frostmere Crypt. So it's very possible that Shalidor found all the words for ice form in his travels, and we know that he liked exploring at Morin Ruins. So this leads us to a few questions. First, is there always significance to where word walls are located? So I certainly think there is sometimes, but not always, just because, there's so many shouts, so how realistic is it that every single word wall placement has some symbolic significance behind it? It'd just be hard to execute something like that from a development standpoint, because you'd have to think of something for every single one. But yeah, I certainly think there is meaning behind it sometimes. For instance, there's a word for marked for death in the Dark Brotherhood Sanctuary. Now that makes some symbolic sense. Another example is there's a word for drain vitality in Dim Hollow Crypt. That makes some sense given that's a vampire dungeon. I wanted to make sure to explain this now because this is not the only time this concept comes up in this video. What I'll leave you with for now is yes, I do believe there is sometimes intent behind the placement of word walls, and that meaning is not always so obvious. Another question raised by Shalidor being able to shout is, was he Dragonborn? So the case to be made that he was is A, he seems to have known how to shout, and 2, we know that he explored at Morin Ruins, so maybe he was looking for word walls. But nothing I'm going to present to you in this video is contingent upon it, because we know that anyone can learn how to shout within the context of the lore, it's just in the actual game it's a mechanic. So I certainly think it's possible that he was Dragonborn, I'm just not convinced of it. After all, he definitely was good at learning things, so it's very conceivable that maybe he wasn't Dragonborn and was just able to learn it more easily than most people do because he was smart. And as we'll see when we break down another one of Shalidor's secrets, he had a certain exploit, if you will, that would have been very useful in mastering the voice. So those are my thoughts on how Shalidor created the Fortress of Ice, but now we need to ask why. Well, there's a later historical event that I believe holds the answer. In year 572 of the Second Era, just a decade before the events of ESO, an Akaviri legion invaded Tamriel. Historically, Tamriel had been visited by the Sayesi of Akavir, who were snake-like in appearance, but the soldiers of this invasion force were from a region in Akavir called Kamal, which means snow hell. So presumably, Kamal has a cold climate. The only source that gets close to describing what these Kamali people look like is in the book Mysterious Akavir, where the author just refers to them as demons. But the main book we need to look at here is the Second Akaviri Invasion. Firstly, it draws attention to something odd about the Kamali invasion plan. For reasons unknown, the Akaviri fleet sailed around the northeast corner of Tamriel into the Sea of Ghosts, bypassing the Telvanni Peninsula, Vardenfell, and Solstheim before finally landing at the mouth of the White River northeast of Windhelm. Why start their campaign at Windhelm, then march south? That route is surrounded on all sides, which ultimately ended up being their undoing when they got cornered in Stonefalls. It would have made much more strategic sense to land somewhere like the Telvanni Peninsula than try to take control of the Inner Sea. So why start the invasion in northern Skyrim? Well, why invade Tamriel to begin with? Was it simply conquest, or could it have been something more? Well, another passage of the book offers an answer. The leader of this second invasion was the King of Kamal, Ada Sumdir Kamal. We know little about him or his reasons for invading Tamriel, even from our agents in the Eastern Kingdom. Few captured Akaviri knew any Tamrielic, and most died under interrogation. One report stated that Dir Kamal was seeking someone or something called the Ordained Receptacle, but this could easily be a bungled translation. What in Oblivion is this Ordained Receptacle, and why would the King of Kamal want it? Well, I believe it's the Eye of Magnus. Nate's actually suggested this before too. As we progress in the college questline, we find reason to believe that blood has been spilled over this thing before. It seems to be the reason why the Snow Elves sacked Saarfall during the Night of Tears. And one of the things the college takes an interest in as they're researching it is what's inside of it, suggesting that part of the idea is that it's a container, a receptacle, if you will. Furthermore, Michael Kirkbride wrote an unofficial story about the Eye of Magnus for his buddy Kurt Coleman as a birthday present many years ago, and he decided to present the Eye of Magnus as a prison for a robot from the Ninth Era named Kinmoon. I think that former developer Michael Kirkbride was just having a bit of fun here, but I do believe that he has some idea of what the Eye of Magnus actually is, given that he's responsible for so much of the game's lore. So his unofficial idea here probably isn't too far off from the real thing, and he chose to make it Kinmoon's receptacle. Also, this ordained receptacle being the Eye of Magnus would explain why the King of Cabal wanted it so badly. Whatever it is, it's immensely powerful. We get a taste of what it can do from Ancano. I can absolutely see a king wanting this kind of power. And whatever the Snow Elves knew about it, they thought the atrocities they committed at the Night of Tears were worth getting to it. So I'm very confident that the reason the Kamali invaded Tamriel in the Second Era was because they were after the Eye of Magnus. But what does that have to do with Shalidor in the First Era? Well, remember, Shalidor had Farsight. Here's what I believe went down here. Shalidor was looking into the future as he sometimes did, and he foresaw the Kamali invasion. So he created the Fortress of Ice right above Saarfall to protect the Eye of Magnus from Ada Sumdir Kamal. Why make a fortress out of ice rather than something normal like wood or stone? After all, he did use stone to make the College of Winterhold, didn't he? Because as ice, it's camouflaged. If anyone ever came looking for the Eye of Magnus, it would just look like another glacier to them. However, if this is what the Kamali were after, then why didn't they go further west to go get it? Well, there actually is some reason to believe that they did. I don't want to spoil too much of this right now because this is actually part of what my next video is going to be about, but yeah, there is some reason to believe that Kamali troops were sent further west than Windhelm. Another possibility here that, albeit is not mutually exclusive with them sending troops further west, is that maybe they misinterpreted their intel. A question that I have yet to address is how did the Kamali know to look for this ordained receptacle in Skyrim? So none of the sources say anything about this, but when we consider what we do know, there is an obvious possibility that makes a lot of sense here. And that's that the Kamali had someone with Farsight, and they somehow saw that it was in Skyrim through the Dreamsleeve. And as we know from Shalidor, information coming from the Dreamsleeve is often limited. So what sort of mistake could that have led the Kamali into? Well, take a moment here and think about some things you know about Saarfall from the lore. Let's see, it's located just a bit uphill from the coastline where the first Atmorans arrived in Skyrim, making it the first Atmoran settlement. Now think about some things you know about Windhelm. It's the snowiest city in the province, and it's also the oldest still inhabited city. So let's say the Dreamsleeve granted you some sort of vision, and in this vision, either someone tells you, or one way or another, you come across the information that the ordained receptacle is in Skyrim's oldest city. Is that Saarfall or Windhelm? They're both sometimes described along the lines of the oldest city in Skyrim, it's just meant in two different ways for each one. So if you're from Akavir and you don't speak much Tamrielic, then going off what the Dreamsleeve told you, cross-referencing that with all the sources, it's understandable that you may get Windhelm and Saarfall confused. So perhaps the Kamali sacked Windhelm because they thought the Eye of Magnus was there. And if the king ever did send troops further west, that's probably because he eventually realized that they were in the wrong place. So to conclude this section, I'll summarize the details. Sometime in the First Era, Shalidor foresaw that the Kamali would come to Skyrim looking for the Eye of Magnus. What exactly the Dreamsleeve showed him is a mystery, but going off his insights, he has these passages from books from the future, so going off that, maybe the idea is that he literally read about it in the book we talked about, the Second Akaviri Invasion. So in anticipation that they may discover or may already know that it's in Saarfall, he froze a fortress of ice right above Saarfall to hide it. Then, thousands of years later, the College of Winterhold excavated the Fortress of Ice because they knew it was Shalidor's home, and they discovered Saarfall underneath it, so they dug it up to get to the ruins. Which is, of course, where we enter the story. And with that, we have exposed the first of Shalidor's secrets. That is how and why he created the Fortress of Ice. Now it's time to discuss Bromjunaar Sanctuary and Konahrik. First, we should make sure to acknowledge that we know the vision for this is incomplete. Joel Burgess, a former Bethesda dev, once said that he originally intended to make Bromjunaar Sanctuary a player home, but he never found the time to do it. So from that we know Bethesda didn't do everything they originally intended to with this place. And man, that made piecing all this together really, really hard because I was working with incomplete ideas. And I think they may have made some adjustments to the vision along the line as well as a result of not being able to follow through on everything they had planned. Also, I think that ZeniMax retconned what the Skyrim team was going for a little bit for ESO. Nevertheless, I think I got it. I think I've unraveled the mysteries of this place and the mask. So we'll start with what I think the Skyrim team's intentions were for the secret purpose of this place. The ruins that we refer to as Labyrinthian are what's left of an ancient city called Bromjunaar, which we know a little bit about from a few sources. Holdings of Jarl Gjalland tells us that the city was an exporter of lumber and stone. Also, a minor maze tells us that it is a known thing that the highest-ranking priests of the Dragon Cult met at Bromjunaar to discuss matters of ruling. Which leads us to Bromjunaar Sanctuary. When we first discover this mysterious building, we find a skeleton, a note called Hired Fug's Missive, and the wooden mask. Perhaps this mask was made from the wood that Bromjunaar was once known to export. If we put it on while we're inside the sanctuary, we'll be transported to what seems like could be the past. To make sure we're staying consistent, let's refer to the Sanctuary like the default one where we're not wearing the mask as Sanctuary Alpha. And we'll call the place that we're transported to when we put the mask on Sanctuary Beta. So in Beta, the whole structure is in pristine condition, and we can place other Dragon Priest masks that we've collected throughout Skyrim on these busts. Once we found and placed all 8 of them, the dragon's mouth will open, revealing a new mask called Konahrik. So, a lot to break down here. Let's start by reading the note. It seemed like an easy enough job. Groz and me done plenty like it before. Some chinless Breton wants bodyguards for a trip into the mountains. Fine, easy clink for us. He goes on about this twice-forsaken mask of his the whole way, of course. Got a pretty good laugh when Groz snatched it and put it on her face. He threatened to fire us for that one. Not smart out here on your own. He realized that right fast and shut up about not paying. So we get here, he thumbs through some papers and mutters to himself. Never you mind that me and Groz had to cut through 10 stinking trolls just to get him here. And without so much as a warning, poof. He put on that mask and vanished. Could have put my hands on his throat one moment, the next he's not so much as thin air. Well, after a while, we didn't know what to do, and Groz picks her gear up to head home. When he poofs back, that mask in his hand, begs us not to leave, says he needs us to wait. This is what he's paying us for. Then he puts the mask back on his sorry face and he's gone again. I'd seen cloaks do invisibility before, but a few swings of my fist proved he wasn't pulling that one. Nothing there to hit. He shows up again, tells us he just needs more time, has to figure out something about other masks, and vanishes again. That was yesterday. I'm done with twiddling my thumbs and writing letters to myself. We're leaving come sunrise. And if he shows up again, I promise Azura, I'm putting this dagger through his chest to keep him in one place. We'll pull more loot off him dead than he could have paid alive. But not the mask. That cursed thing could stay here and rot with him and the trolls right here. The Breton noticed that the bodyguards were about to leave for Beta, so when someone is in Beta, they're not completely out of touch with Alpha. When we're in Beta, we have no obvious awareness of what's going on in Alpha, but that's because of development limitations. Like, think about how you'd have to do something like that from a development standpoint. The two cells would sort of need to be on top of each other with only Beta tangible, Yeah, like, it's just more trouble than it's worth. Like, how many players are gonna think to bring a follower with them here just for the sake of seeing if they can still hear, like, what they're saying while they're in beta? But based on this note, we can tell that the intention within the fictional context is that when you're in beta, you're not completely out of touch with alpha. Yet the wearer's physical form seems to only be tangible in beta. So what exactly is Sanctuary Beta? At first glance, it seems like putting on the mask brings us to the past. As in, we're literally in this same room back in ancient Bromjunaar. Here's what the game guide says. If you don the mask while standing in the chamber with the altar, everything fades to black. When you come to, you're in what appears to be the same room, but in another time. The key word here is appears. It appears to be the same room, but in the past, but this wording leaves room for doubts. Furthermore, there are some issues with this being the literal past. First, it's a bit convenient that we can stay in here indefinitely without anyone from the Dragon Cult showing up. We can of course make a similar case to what we just said about hearing voices from Alpha in Beta. Anything from the player's perspective is something a dev has to make, so why bother making something where someone actually shows up? It's not like most players spend a huge amount of time in there anyway, so why can't it just be assumed that whenever you're in there, it happens to be when no one else is? And that's fair, but it's a problem for the story with the Breton too. When we examine the story, we see that he must have been in beta at least a full day without anyone showing up and saying, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" Also, it conflicts with the original intention of this being a player home. You know, because that just kind of forces the question too much. Like, you know, like if you're literally like living in there, like it's like, how is it that no one ever shows up and is like, why is there, you know, a dragonborn sleeping in here? So if this is not the past, then what is it? Well, the most logical explanation is that Beta is a pocket realm. That would explain the unique rules at work here. Also, the structure is round, which the game guide makes sure to draw attention to twice. Why does that matter? Because roundness has to do with the Psijic endeavor, which is what enables one to create pocket realms. You see, the structure of the Elder Scrolls universe is often represented as a wheel, especially in the more astral sources written by characters like Vivek and Mankar Cameron. And I believe this is inspired by the actual game disc. So when a character completes the second walking way, the Psijic endeavor, they come to understand the structure, and from that understanding, they learn how to make smaller wheels within the big wheel, and those smaller wheels are pocket realms. This leads to the question, do they have to be round? So that's actually a really hard question, and one that I'm not really sure how to answer without giving other theorists out there too big a hint about a subject I've been saving. So here's what I'll say for now. I do believe that in Skyrim, Bethesda always incorporated some significant round thing in that game's pocket realms in order to hint that they are pocket realms. And the hint for this one is that the building is round. I'm not sure if ZeniMax did this for ESO's pocket realms just because I haven't played that game in a while. And I'm also not sure if Bethesda did this for the Oblivion Remaster's pocket realms just because I haven't reached a point in that game where I'd be able to tell yet. What I need to see is Cameron's Paradise. I need to look for some significant round visual in there. So yeah, I guess that's where I'll leave you on this subject for now. In Skyrim, pocket realms always have some significant, roughly round visual. So where is Beta actually physically located? Most pocket realms that we know about are in Oblivion, but some experts, including myself, don't believe they have to be. For instance, I believe that the Clockwork City is a pocket realm located in the Void, not Oblivion. But is Beta in Oblivion? It is worth noting that the building and these mountains somewhat resemble the Daedric Sigil Oat, and it doesn't need to be this way. These mountains don't need to be here, yet the dev chose to place them here. So we might consider that maybe Beta is in Oblivion, and the wooden mask maybe serves the function of a sigil stone. Regardless, for our purposes in understanding Shalidor's history with Beta, where exactly it's located doesn't really matter. Now let's see if we can figure out the purpose of Beta, because that could shed some light on who might have made this pocket realm and why. If this is not the past, why does it seem like the past? Well, because everything in here seems new. We are used to seeing Dragon Cult structures in disrepair, but everything in here is in pristine condition. It's as if time is frozen in here, or at least runs slower, and that would make a lot of sense as an added convenience for the Dragon Priests that would meet in Bromjunaar. A minor maze asserts that it is known that the highest-ranking Dragon Priest would meet in Bromjunaar to discuss government matters. Discussing matters of that nature often takes a very long time. So if they somehow use this little realm where time stands still or runs slower for those meetings, they could take all the time they needed to work everything out, then simply exit without any significant amount of time having gone by in Mundus. After all, we know that each bust is really just a holder for a mask. So it seems logical that this is the room they would meet in, since, this is like a coat rack for them. The idea is probably that they would take the regular mask off, put it on their bust, then they'd put a wooden mask on and be transported to Beta where they'd have the meeting. However, there's a big problem with this. Based on all my tests both in PC and console, the timescale in here appears to be exactly the same as it is among this. We could of course work around this with things like, well, maybe we're meant to assume that time stands still in here or at least runs slower within the context of the lore, but the devs just didn't see it as worth it to actually implement in the game. After all, the slow time shout doesn't actually slow the timescale down, it's just a slow-mo effect, but within the fictional context we're meant to believe that it actually slows time down. Or we could assume that adjusting the timescale in here was one of the things that Joel Burgess meant to do, but just never did. However, we seemingly know, or at least are pretty sure, that time wasn't frozen in there for the Breton mentioned in the note, because the bodyguards were annoyed by how long he was gone. So where does that leave us? Well, perhaps Bethesda originally intended to make the timescale slower in beta, but somewhere along the line they decided not to. Could be they were worried about unforeseen technical complications. Something off the top of my head is Burgess probably intended to put crafting stations in here to go with the player home. And if the timescale were slower or completely frozen, we could use that to exploit the potion system. So it could be they thought that'd be too big an exploit because then we could get, like fortify smithing and enchanting potions and just use them in there and, we'd never have to use another one. Though there's one more possibility that we haven't explored yet. What if the idea is that there is a way to make time go slower in here, at least within the context of the lore, but it's not automatic, it's something one has to manually initiate? That does fit pretty well with something we've discussed already. The game guide refers to this structure as an altar. Doesn't that imply that it serves some sort of ritualistic purpose? So, maybe back in the days of the Dragon Cult, when the altar in Alpha was still in one piece, there was a ritual that could be performed in Alpha that would change the timescale in Beta. Hence, the reason time wasn't altered for the Breton, nor is it for us, is because we don't know the ritual, and even if we did, we can't use it because the altar in Alpha is broken. And I have a few ideas for how this ritual might work, and I suppose they are mutually inclusive, as in they could all be true at once. Firstly, it could be something to do with the Psijic endeavor. Maybe one of the dragon priests had achieved it, and they were the creator of Bromjunaar Sanctuary, so they would just freeze time when the meeting started, then unfreeze it at the end. But I'm not a huge fan of this idea, because one of the things I've noted about the Psijic endeavor in all my research on it is it seems to have limits. And I'm hesitant to believe that people that have achieved it can alter time at will. That seems a bit too OP to me. Another thing that's worth noting is that the word wall in the main burial crypt is for slow time. So perhaps the ritual involves that shout, or at least the words for it, in some kind of prayer maybe. There is a dragon skull right in the middle of the altar, so maybe the dragon priest would say some sort of prayer to Alduin, their time god, and that would freeze time in beta. A third idea I'll throw in here is that maybe simply putting all the masks on the bus in alpha freezes time in beta. After all, if they have to be wearing wooden ones to enter beta, then wouldn't they all need to take the regular masks off and put a wooden one on to enter the meeting anyway? And like I already said, the bus kinda makes sense as like a coat rack. Also, what happens when we put each mask on each bust in beta? The dragon's mouth opens. So it seems likely that if Alpha's altar were still intact, putting the masks on those busts would also open the dragon's mouth, or at least do something to the dragon. And what do dragons represent? Time. So it'd make a lot of sense that whatever it is that freezes time in beta has to do with the dragon skull. Regardless of the details, I believe that what Bethesda's going for here is there's some sort of ritual that can be performed in alpha that freezes time in beta. And the lore-friendly reason why time is not frozen for us, nor was it for the Breton in that story, is because we don't know the ritual, and even if we did, it's not going to work because Alpha's altar is broken. So why do I think that's the answer here? Because it can help us decipher a secret about our main man, Shalidor. If you've already pieced it together, well done. If you're not quite there yet, listen to Urag's line here one more time.
He holed himself up in Labyrinthian, and devoted all his time to research and study. What more than you would imagine possible?
He seems to be implying that most of Shalidor's work was written in Labyrinthian, and he often draws attention to how Shalidor was questionably prolific. So, with all the information we just went over in mind, how was Shalidor able to learn so much and write so much in a single lifetime? He used Bromjunaar Sanctuary to freeze time, did tons of research and writing in beta, then simply exited without any significant amount of time having passed in Mundus. After all, that was back in the First Era, so it seems likely that Alpha's altar would have still been intact. We also know that Shalidor had a vested interest in the Dragon Cult, so he probably came across some source about Bromjunaar Sanctuary in his studies and found the ritual. One of the reasons I tried so hard to decipher bits of Shalidor's insights is because I wonder if one of these paragraphs is the ritual. I spent a lot of time on this section specifically because it looks kinda like the language those etched tablets in the main Labyrinthian dungeon and along the 7,000 steps are written in. But it's not an exact match. So if anyone thinks they've decoded this or anything else from Shalidor's insights, please comment with it. Furthermore, we've already discussed how there's some reason to think that Shalidor could use the Ice Form Shout, and now we have something that could suggest he knew Slow Time as well. It's not quite as promising because the ritual involving the Slow Time Shout isn't necessary to the theory, but it is worth considering since there is a word wall for Slow Time in these ruins. Also, another one of the theories I presented about how the ritual might work has a problem as well. If Shalidor was able to perform this ritual, then doesn't it follow that it can't evolve the masks because then he'd need to have them? That's a possibility, but they also don't think it's out of the question that Shalidor may have found the workaround for something like that. You know, like maybe he saw all 8 of them through the Dreamsleeve and found the way to trick the altar into thinking they were placed to get the dragon's mouth to open. Maybe he literally saw every mask that he needed through the Dreamsleeve, then just made replicas with the same materials, then put the same enchantments on them, and he used that to trick the altar. I'll put it this way, if something like that were possible, then Shalidor would definitely be the person to figure it out. Another thing we should address is that if time isn't frozen in beta, then why are the ruins in such good condition? Well, because in here they're undisturbed by most common causes of wear and tear, like rodents, weather conditions, and people for the most part at least. Yeah, only a handful of people ever enter beta, do they? So given all that, the structures in here have held up pretty well. Also, what was Joel Burgess's original idea for this place? He wanted it to be a player home. So he probably meant to put things like a bed, some dressers, the crafting stations, he meant to put all that regular player home stuff in here. But that doesn't seem a likely furniture arrangement for the Dragon Priest that would use this room for meetings. They'd do something like a big table. So Joel's idea was probably that Shalidor converted this place into a home because he spent a huge amount of time in here. And when we would have unlocked it as a player home, we would essentially be inheriting it from him. Now let's talk about how Zenimax seems to have retconned the vision here a little bit for ESO. This line of Shalidor's seems to imply that there were multiple rituals that he used to prolong his life and that they worked outside the beta. Though if we actually reduce what's being said here to its literal meaning, it doesn't necessarily conflict with anything we've established. Because when he says rituals, he could just mean the same ritual to freeze time in beta that he used multiple times. However, there are other times in which they confirm that Shalidor was alive for thousands of Mundus years. Which what we've established so far with Skyrim doesn't explain because, if beta was his only method of cheating time, well that wouldn't actually give him more Mundus years, would it? But I'm very confident that the theory we've established with the clues from Skyrim is right. I mean, Urag says he was constantly running off to Labyrinthian, and he wrote such a huge amount and such a wide array of subjects that it's suspicious. It's like, well, how could someone know this much and have written so much in just a single lifetime? Then when we get to Labyrinthian, we find this little room where time seems to be frozen. It seems to be set up to be a cheat code for time. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that this is what the Skyrim team was going for. That fit is just too good to be wrong. It's there, and it's just the right amount of obvious. It's not too obvious, but you can get it if you think about it, and even if you do, it doesn't unravel the whole theory for you, it just gets you started. It gets you the connection between Shalidor and Bromjunaar Sanctuary. So there's no doubt in my mind that the Skyrim team's vision for this is that the reason Shalidor was constantly running off to Labyrinthian, and how he was able to know so much and write so much in a single lifetime, is Bromjunaar Sanctuary. So the ESO team has made some adjustments to the vision. The main change here is they seem to have given him some extra rituals he could use the Dragon Altar for that could prolong his life outside of beta. After all, this isn't too big a stretch because we know that he was always looking for more ways to extend his life since he so intently pursued Glamoril. So who's to say he didn't find some? Having beta certainly would have given him time to look for more. So why did ZeniMax add these extra rituals he could do with the Dragon Altar? Well, there's two logical reasons. First, they chose to explore Shalidor as an actual walking talking character, not just a name on the page. And to do that, he needed to be around other characters for storytelling purposes. But if he always had to be in Bromjunaar Sanctuary to prolong his life, well, that all becomes a lot harder, doesn't it? And the second reason is, well, I'll put it this way. Let's say they really did stick to it and told every story with Shalidor from beta. If he had actually been in there for every journal, flashback, and other bit of lore that they added to his story, then eventually it would have become obvious that there's a connection between him and that place. Like I said before, the Skyrim devs left it at just the right level of obviousness. So the ZeniMax devs probably didn't want to ruin it out of respect for those developers. So they came up with this idea that maybe Shalidor was able to find some new rituals as a way that they could maintain at least most of Bethesda's original vision while also telling their own stories. And this was really smart, because it maintains that he does need to scurry off to Labyrinthian sometimes, because he still needs the altar. It also allowed them plenty of flexibility to tell stories about him with Ulfsild, Ivea, Sheogorath, and all that good stuff, all the while without making it too obvious that there is a connection between him and Bromjunaar Sanctuary. Another thing I want to make sure to clarify is that the Skyrim team's original intention seems to have been that Shalidor had a normal Mundus lifespan. That's why Urag is so suspicious of how prolific he was. It's, he lived a regular life, yet wrote enough for several lifetimes worth. But the ESO team retconned this and made it so he actually did live more Mundus years because of these other rituals. So why'd they do that? Well, there's the things we've already discussed, but also, I don't want to spoil anything, so I'll just be vague here. It goes better with the theme of Shalidor's story, both what the Skyrim team was going for and what ESO added. It just goes better with the theme. So, my friends, I believe we found the reason why Shalidor was always scurrying off to Labyrinthian. The vision may have changed a little bit from Skyrim to ESO, but the gist is, he needed this altar to extend his life. I actually think this is what Shalidor chronologically did first of all the things I'm covering in this video, because it's what gave him the time to learn all the things he needed to know to do the other things. Though if the ritual to freeze time in beta does involve using the slow time shout, well then he would have needed to know that one ahead of time. But he very well may have mastered Ice Form and whatever other shouts he knew in beta. And this is likely where he did most of his research on Glamoril. Now that the big reveal is out of the way, we should talk about Konahrik. As some of you know, I actually made a lot of the discoveries we're covering in this video a few months ago, back when I was investigating Konahrik as part of the 5 Unsolved Skyrim Mysteries video. And I presented 2 theories for the background of Konahrik, but I didn't crown a winner. Now it's time to. I'll do a rundown of each theory to bring everyone up to speed. They both have the same conclusion, which is that we, the last Dragonborn, are Konahrik. But who left the mask here and why? The first option is that the dragon priest that would meet here made the mask in the sequence of the bus, making it so one has to obtain their mask to get to Konahrik as an elaborate succession plan in the event that the dragons were defeated by the tongues. As in, to claim lordship of the dragon cult in that event, one has to defeat these 8 dragon priests that take their mask to Bromjunaar Sanctuary and claim Konahrik. Option 2 is that Shalidor made the mask for us and locked it away in the altar as a way of training us for a battle with Miraak. The idea in this case is that Shalidor foresaw that the last Dragonborn would need to fight Miraak through the Dreamsleeve, so he devised this system with the busts as a way to get us to go fight a bunch of dragon priests, thus training us to fight the most powerful dragon priest. So which one am I going with? Well, as you might have surmised from everything I've told you about Bromjunaar Sanctuary, I believe the first theory is the right one, and here's why. This all being Shalidor's plan really works best if he is the creator of Beta, and we know that he was capable of making pocket realms. However, I realized early on that there's a glaring issue with him having made this one. Why not make it anywhere? A small room that he could use to escape time would be very useful to him, but why make it here? Why not simply make it in the college or in his home? That's why I'm convinced that Beta already existed by the time Shalidor found these ruins, because it creates a reason why he had to constantly scurry off here like Urag says he did. But why couldn't he simply create his own pocket realm where time runs slower somewhere else? Likely because whatever dragon priest created Beta had something they used to do it that he simply couldn't replicate. I mean, we know that the way certain magical rules can stack up in Elder Scrolls can change things inside of pocket realms from entering the Soul Cairn for Dawnguard. And by the way, that's an important thing to understand about pocket realms. The outside and inside are not two completely separate things. What they're made of, how they're constructed, and what plane of existence they reside in all make a difference. Outside influences inside. So my guess is there's something about Bromjunaar Sanctuary that makes a timeless pocket realm possible. And Shalidor simply didn't have the component he needed to make his own somewhere else. Could have been like one of Alduin's scales, per se. There's no getting another one of those. Speaking of Alduin, we might consider that he is the creator of Beta, and he gave it to the Dragon Priest so that they could better run the government. And I wonder if part of what Shalidor was hoping to uncover in all his research on the Dragon Cult and Alduin specifically is how he could do this himself. Additionally, there are some other clues that are more in line with the first theory. Konahrik means warlord, a very fitting title for one who claims power by defeating rivals. It's also made of gold, which could signify that it serves the purpose of a crown. Also, I think it's possible that the mask being a gold-skinned face could be an innuendo to a concept that fortunately I have covered before. You see, I theorize that the Sigil endeavor is part of what I call the Path of the Godhead, which is the 2nd, 5th, and 6th walking ways together. And those that attempt this path sometimes end up with gold skin, most notably Vivek. This gold skin is also mentioned in Mankar Cameron's Mythic Dawn commentaries. By the book, take this key and pierce the divine shell that encloses the mantle takers, the skin of gold, Scarab I Arbex. Though here it seems to be more in reference to the 6th walking way, the scarab that transforms into the new man, rather than the 2nd, the Sigil endeavor. So who is this godhead? Well, I, and a few other experts like Darilov, who was generous enough to shout me out recently, theorize that the players are the godhead. In a nutshell, I think that part of the idea behind the Path of the Godhead is that the walker is exiting the disc, then the console, and looking at the player holding the controller, and that's the godhead. And who's Konahrik, the last Dragonborn, as in us, the players? So I think it's possible that part of the idea with Konahrik being gold is it's a reference to how sometimes those that face the godhead become gold. Or maybe the Dragon Priests were hoping that Konahrik would walk the Path of the Godhead. I'm not sold on this aspect of it, but I think it's definitely worth considering. There's one last thought we should discuss to conclude this chapter. Shalidor used Bromjunaar Sanctuary to cheat time. So could this be the origin of the claim that he stole Glamoril from Akatosh? As in, he stole time from the God of Time? I think it's a strong possibility, but it's not the only one. I also want to take just a moment to remind you that my campaign for the Alzheimer's Association is still open, so if you want to support the cause or you just want to learn more, then you should visit the link in the description when you're finished watching. The next secret of Shalidor's for us to unravel is how he constructed the College of Winterhold, and that he perhaps did so with a whispered spell. Could this be some sort of shout? We've already covered a few things that could suggest that Shalidor could use the voice. He seems to have had an interest in Wolfarth because of the shout that he learns in Old Knocker, what happens when you shake the dragon just so. He also may have used ice form to create the Fortress of Ice, and some of the rituals he performed at the Dragon Altar may have involved slow time. Even if he wasn't Dragonborn, Bromjunaar Sanctuary would have given him all the time he needed to master the voice. And we know that there are some shouts that are more whispered than shouted, such as Aura Whisper and Fro Voice. So let's talk a bit about the Thu'um. According to a Kirkbride Reddit post, it was originally inspired by a similar power in David Lynch's Doom movie. But what's the full vision that this evolved into in Elder Scrolls? So this is all very speculative, but I do have a running theory for this that I tend to use as like the baseline. Perhaps the idea is that it's an in-game manifestation of the very power that was used to create Elder Scrolls. These games that we all love started as ideas being discussed by Ted Peterson, Julian LeFay, and Vijay Lakshman. They spoke the Elder Scrolls series into being. So maybe the idea with the voice is that it's like an in-game manifestation of that, which displays itself like a power. And it's a whole lot like tonal architecture, isn't it? After all, if the voice is the power that created this world, then shouldn't it also be able to make adjustments to it? This also gets interesting when we consider who some of the main creators among this were: Lorkhan, Kain, Auriel, and Magnus. Theoretically, every god involved in the creation of Mundus would have needed to have cleared the Sigil endeavor, or maybe it was always innate in them. But what's relevant for our purposes is how they created. So I don't think it was the same for every god, but Kain's tool of creation seems to have been her voice, since multiple stories tell of her breathing onto the lands to form humans. Also, little side note here, a lot of these creation concepts are like bordering on the fourth wall, or are at least inspired by real things. So in that regard, we might consider that Auriel was the producer, Magnus was the programmer, Lorcan the writer, and Kain the designer. Just a neat little thought to consider. So how is this all relevant to Shalidor and the college? Well, there's a key question we have yet to really address about the Psijic endeavor. What are the limits to this ability to create that it grants those that achieve it? What can they create in realms that were created by others, like Mundus and the Plains of Oblivion, without having to make their own realm within the realm? So that's a really hard question. My belief is that it must have some limits, because without any, it's just a giant mess of plot holes. You know, it's like Force Healing in Star Wars. And if we actually think for a second about what an obvious limit would be, there is actually something that would make a lot of sense. They probably have to use the same toolset that whatever given realm they wish to create in was originally made with. You know, because if you need to unscrew something, you need a screwdriver, don't you? Or if it's Nintendo Switch, then you need that obscure tri-pronged screwdriver that you're only ever gonna need for that one purpose. Jokes aside, perhaps a better analogy would be video games. You know, if you want to mod Skyrim, you need to use computer codes. You can't use like a car battery. So maybe the reason that the voice can make certain possibilities actualities in Mundus is because that's the tool that Kain used to do her part in creating Mundus. Though for most that actually use the voice, they can only use it to do things that Kain and the other creators decided that just anyone could do with it because they haven't cleared the Psijic endeavor. Or another possibility we might consider is that this isn't something that the creators planned, but rather all mortals are able to use the voice at least for temporary effects because they all have bits of divine in them. You know, because in Elder Scrolls mortals are descendant of the divine. Regardless, most beings can't actually use the voice to do things that Kain was able to use it to do because they haven't cleared the Psijic endeavor. However, Shalidor did. So, perhaps he simply used that whispered spell to speak the College of Winterhold into being, maybe even the whole city of Winterhold. Because since he had stacked the Psijic endeavor with being able to use the voice, he could create just like Kain did. He could speak permanent things into being in Mundus, just as she spoke humans into being. And yeah, we could combine this notion with what we established about the Fortress of Ice too. Maybe he spoke it into being by combining his creation abilities granted by the Psijic endeavor with the Ice Form Shout. Another thing that we might consider based on all this is that maybe the reason that magic can be used to make certain possibilities actualities in Mundus is because that's Magnus's tool of creation. But like I said in the beginning, this is definitely the most speculative section of this video, but it's what I got, so there you go. That's the best explanation I have as to how Shalidor could have created the college and maybe the whole city of Winterhold with a whispered spell. So why did Shalidor create the college? Well, in the Elder Scrolls Legends card game, a curious line plays in the Elnifex language when the College of Winterhold card is played. Igar Tak, Pad Home, CHIM Ialtadun. For those who don't know, CHIM is the fifth walking way, and I theorize that it's the next step along the path of the Godhead after the Psijic endeavor. The pronunciation of CHIM is sometimes debated by fans. Some say CHIM like I'm saying it as in chimney, and others say it as Kim like how you pronounce Chimer. I say CHIM because that's how it's pronounced in that Elnifex line I just mentioned. But honestly, it doesn't matter. What I tend to go by when I see a word that's made up and I'm not sure is I just kind of go by phonetic appeal. So what does the college have to do with CHIM? Besides that line, the two things never come up together in lore. Well, it does make some sense with what we've established about Shalidor. I mean, if he walks the first step of the path of the Godhead, then yeah, he may want to walk the next steps too. So could the college somehow be part of his attempts to achieve CHIM? I believe that's right on the money. Observe the shaping of the college. This isn't the only time we've seen something shaped like this in Elder Scrolls. The Imperial City has a very similar layout. So what's the significance of this shaping? Well, the bulk of all this lore with the Walking Ways was written back in the early 2000s during Morrowind's development. And part of what's required to achieve CHIM is understanding the structure of the Elder Scrolls universe as a wheel, which is an allegory for the game disc. For anyone that doesn't know what that is, back in the day there used to be this shiny flat thing with a hole in it that you'd put in your console and that was the game. So with those two things in mind, what about this shaping might sort of symbolically help someone go through the mental endeavors of achieving CHIM? Well, back in 2002, Morrowind was released for PC and the original Xbox. And one of the disk drives used for original Xboxes looked like this. These are Samsung drives, and based on all my research both online and from looking at consoles, these seem to have been the most common ones. And man, that guy at the old school tech store really looked at me weird when I asked him if I could look at all his original Xbox's disk drives. So maybe the idea behind this shaping is that making structures with this old school Samsung disk drive shape in Mundus can help characters achieve CHIM because, it's a disk reader. It helps them fathom the structure of their universe as a wheel, as a disk. It helps them read the disk. And that's what Shalidor was trying to do with the college. He was hoping that looking down upon it from his rooftop balcony could help him walk through the mental endeavors of achieving CHIM. And yes, I do believe that Tiber Septim did the same thing by looking down upon the Imperial City from White Gold Tower, and who knows what other emperors and alien rulers did so before him as well. And if anyone out there has seen my coverage of the Walking Ways before, then you know that this is very in line with what I theorized about the first Walking Way as well. That one's called the Prolix Towers, and my theory for it is a very similar principle. It's this idea that certain physical structures in Mundus can help characters through the Walking Ways because it makes it so they don't have to imagine all of it. Another question we should ask here is if that was the purpose of the college, then why did he end up using it as a school? Well, perhaps he was hoping that some of the minds he trained here might help him figure CHIM out. I know when I'm stuck on something, I ask for help. And that leads us to the bigger question, which is, did he ever figure it out? Did he ever achieve CHIM? Well, based on all my findings, I think the answer is no. That's what fits best with the whole picture, which you'll see as we bring everything full circle with Glamoril. So why couldn't Shalidor figure CHIM out? Well, this step of the Path of the Godhead has a particular association with the concept of the thief. An observation I made a while ago that comes up sometimes is how throughout Elder Scrolls lore, there's this repeated emphasis on this trio of archetypes, the warrior, mage, and thief. We see this prominently displayed with the Tribunal, with Almalexia as the warrior, Sophisil as the mage, and Vivek as the thief. Also, keen fans may have spotted this one as well, Wolfarth warrior, Zurin Arctis mage, and Tiber Septim thief. Vivek and Tiber Septim both achieved CHIM for their respective trios. In fact, I believe that the reason Almalexia and Sophisil created Vivek is because they knew that they needed to add a thief to their soul stack to achieve CHIM. You see, to achieve CHIM, as Kirkbride puts it, a character needs to take the tower's secret, which in a nutshell is understanding the reality of their existence within the Elder Scrolls fiction. And only those that embody the archetype of thief can do that. Kirkbride touches on this in his series of unofficial posts that are referred to as Vex's teaching. The thief is another metaphorical absolute. In this case, he represents the taking of the tower, or, and sometimes more importantly, the taking of the tower's secrets. So why can only thieves take the tower's secret, thus achieving CHIM? Well, Kirkbride's use of the term thief can be a little misleading. The thief archetype is really this universe's equivalent of what theologians call the trickster character, which many ancient mythologies have, such as the Norse Loki, the Greek Odysseus, and the Sumerian Enki. Its defining characteristic isn't being good at stealing, it's being clever, which is what one has to be to fathom the many tricky and symbolic aspects of CHIM. To be clear, I think it is possible for someone to be a combination of warrior, mage, and thief, but when it comes to lore, it's much more common for characters to be just one. A fortunate few characters manage to figure soul stacking out and form trios, such as the Tribunal, and that allows them to utilize each other's strengths. However, our main man Shalidor was a mage through and through. He also spent his life around other mages. So my guess is that he simply couldn't achieve CHIM because he lacked the cunning mindset that comes with being a thief, so he could never take the tower's secret. Sure, he was a remarkably intelligent individual, but in different ways. He had book smarts, but he needed more creative smarts. It's really well set up, and I believe this notion of Shalidor being a very one-dimensional thinker due to being a pure mage is one of the foundational elements of his character. It made him very narrow-minded, which is also what made it difficult for him to figure Glamoril out. And now, my friends, it is time to discuss the Labyrinth and the secret of life it guards, Glamoril. We know that Shalidor sought to extend his life, so could this be an attempt to do just that? In other words, perhaps he did not build the Labyrinth to contain Glamoril, but rather built it because it is the key to creating Glamoril. In the same sense that to make a sword, someone has to have first made a forge. To get that answer, we should start a bit further back. If the Labyrinth's original purpose was to help Shalidor cheat the cycle of life, well then how did he know this structure would help him do that? Given everything we've established, there's an obvious answer. Perhaps he saw it through the Dreamsleeve, either through some astral vision or by actually seeing the finished labyrinth in the future. Both possibilities entail that his understanding of this structure may have been incomplete. When are visions ever the full picture? And simply getting glimpses of it in the future wouldn't give him much information about it. So as we proceed here, keep in mind that Shalidor may not have understood what the Dreamsleeve was showing him entirely right. Regardless, he set out to build this mysterious labyrinth that the Dreamsleeve had showed him in the ruins of Bromjunaar, where he already spent a lot of time. Whether or not this canyon was already here or if he carved this out is something I'm still not decided on, but I don't think it really matters. Though something I want to make sure to establish here that does matter is that I'm fairly certain that everything in here is part of the puzzle, not just the maze itself. I believe the surrounding structures, the waterfall, and the word wall are all part of the hidden meaning of the labyrinth and how it guards Glamoril. So keep that in mind. There's also the translation of Glamoril to be considered. Remember, it means secret of life in Elvish. So why did Shalidor choose this word for what he was trying to make? Well, the real reason is because the Todd regime was married to this idea because that was in Arena. But how did they fit this notion into the lore that was established in the Morrowind through Skyrim era? Well, the Elves of Elder Scrolls are known to live very long lives, and that's what Shalidor was aiming to do. So the idea is probably that he picked the Elven word for it because, well, he's sort of trying to become like an elf. And I do believe that he thought this secret the Dreamsleeve was trying to give him with the Labyrinth was something that could extend his life a very long time. That's what he believed it was. And if that was the case, that would have made it so he didn't have to constantly go back to Bromjunaar Sanctuary to do so. In fact, I believe the Labyrinth works very much like Bromjunaar Sanctuary. Once one clears the maze, they end up being conjured to this little area with a Dremora, a pocket realm, which we'll call the cellar. Remember, when it comes to pocket realms, outside influences inside. So in this case, the whole hourglass structure is like the dragon altar, and clearing the maze with the spell tablets and all that is the ritual for 1, opening a door to the cellar, and 2, conjuring a Dremora. Since after all, if everyone that clears the maze kills the Dremora, then doesn't there need to be a way of replenishing the supply? So doing the maze is a ritual. Alright, but how does that lead to the secret of life? Well, Glamoril is often thought of as an invention of Shalidor's because that's the picture that the sources surrounding it seem to paint. However, pay close attention to this line of Shalidor's from ESO. I began work on a powerful artifact. Let me ask you something. Think back to a time you invented something like a project for school, a picture you drew as a kid, or anything you made. If you were to tell someone about it, would you refer to it as an artifact? Probably not. When we hear the word artifact, we think of things from long before we were born. It's not a word that we'd ever think to use for something that we made, even if we were as old as Shalidor. It's just not how you think of the word artifact. We think of it as predating ourselves. So why would a developer use this term for Glamoril? Could it be a hint for something? Well, artifact is actually a homograph. This same spelling and pronunciation is used for another word that pertains to experimentation. Here's the Merriam-Webster definition: a product of artificial character, as in a scientific test, due usually to extraneous, such as human, agency. In a nutshell, it's a byproduct of an experiment caused by how it was conducted. In laboratories, things like temperature and cleanliness can cause artifacts. I believe the idea that whatever dev wrote this was going for is that Shalidor thought the Dreamsleeve was showing him that the Labyrinth is like a laboratory experiment. Doing the maze and zapping the tablets along the way is the procedure, and opening the gate to the cellar along with what spawns in the cellar is the product. And Shalidor thought the Dreamsleeve was telling him that if he introduced something more to it, he could cause an artifact in the cellar, and this artifact is what he referred to as Glamoril, and he thought it would extend his lifespan. But if this is intentional, then isn't it then not an artifact? Well, remember, he saw the Labyrinth through the Dreamsleeve, so he may have thought it was like someone else's experiments that he was, corrupting with his agency. But regardless, the picture that's being painted here by everything, like the Labyrinth being said to guard the secret of life, and how doing the maze creates a portal to the cellar and the Dremora, is that Shalidor was trying to use the Labyrinth to create Glamoril. So now we need to discuss the how. How did Shalidor believe this process could be augmented to yield Glamoril? This is where I believe the shudders come in. Many of these windows throughout the maze have items in them, but there's no obvious connection between them all. They seem random. However, there is one promising possibility here. Some of them could represent parts of Shalidor's life. The charcoal could be because he did a lot of writing, the drummer parts could be because of his fabled battle with the Rorken clan. The spells could symbolize impressive magical feats or other discoveries he made as a mage. And this little doodad here that I think is an eyeball could be for the Eye of Magnus. And the other items could represent aspects of his life that just aren't as obvious. My guess is the Dreamsleeve showed Shalidor the maze and some of the items that we see in the shutters in his initial vision, and from that he figured the idea was to sort of map out his life in the shutters. And he expected that to change the yield of completing the maze to extending his lifespan. So let's try to get more specific here. How exactly did he think this would work? Perhaps he thought he could conjure a specific Dromora, and/or thought Glamoril was a circlet that the specific Dromora would be wearing. Or maybe he figured that his soul would get stacked with the Dromoras, making him a Daedra, thus immortal. Another, more elaborate idea is maybe he figured the Dragon Priest used a similar process to make Sanctuary Beta, and he thought he could make the Cellar another timeless pocket realm. And he figured he could somehow trick the timeless effect into lasting after his presence there timed out. Maybe by getting the Dromora to trap part of his soul so that part of him was always in there? I don't know. One way or another, Shalidor thought he could prolong his life a very long time, maybe permanently, by putting these items in the shutters and running the maze. And yes, this is why I made sure to explain that the outside of Pocket Realms influences the inside. Because that's the principle that Shalidor is trying to exploit here. He was hoping that by making changes to the altar and the ritual, he could change what's on the inside of the cellar. However, Shalidor did die, so this didn't work. So he must have been stuck, and this is likely where the ESO team decided that Sheogorath came in and offered up the Folium of Discognitum in exchange for Ivea. Let's review exactly what Shalidor says about this deal at the end of ESO's Mages Guild line. Life for an Archmage is measured in decades, not years. The rituals I performed extended my life, allowed me to continue my work, but eventually even I began to slow down. And he offered you this Folium. I began work on a powerful artifact, a key to the inner workings of life itself, Glamoril, but that's neither here nor there. The point is I reached a critical juncture where even my knowledge and power failed me. I needed more. So Shalidor probably thought this Folium held the knowledge or power he needed to get Glamoril to appear in the cellar. Could be he tried putting it in the shutter, but sadly, he was wrong. Sheogorath had played him. So he was stuck, and I believe this is the real reason why he used the Labyrinth to test future Archmages. He was hoping they would figure out what he couldn't, just like with the college and CHIM. So what was Shalidor missing? Why couldn't he get the cellar to yield Glamoril? Well, my friends, I believe that Shalidor had this all wrong. He misunderstood Glamoril from the beginning. So let's reapproach this. The Labyrinth is said to be a maze, though it's not really a maze, is it? It might look like one from the outside, but it's actually just two linear paths that converge on each other. So perhaps it's not a maze in a physical sense, but rather in a mental sense. It's not about walking the linear path and slaying the Dromora, it's about what we're meant to learn from this place. Glamoril is a concept, not a physical thing, which really makes sense when you think about it. How can the secret of life be a physical artifact? Think about a secret of yours or a friend's, like a crush for instance. A crush isn't an object, it's a feeling. Sure, a secret can be about something physical, but the secret itself is an idea. That's what Shalidor failed to understand. Glamoril is a concept, not a physical thing. So we need to examine the Labyrinth from a symbolic perspective to understand it. Once again, Shalidor is thinking like a mage when he needs to be thinking like a thief. So let's break it down. The interior of the so-called maze is really just two linear paths, or really just one if we consider the whole journey from entering the canyon to facing the Dromora as the full experience. This could be another allegory for life. It might have twists and turns, but ultimately there's one start, birth, and one end, death. Now let's revisit the shutters. We've already established that a lot of them could represent parts of Shalidor's life, but there's more to break down. Here's a diagram I made of all the stuff in the shutters. There's something very interesting going on here, isn't there? You'd never notice it when you're actually in the maze, yet all but one of the shutters with items in them are on this side. There's only one filled shutter on the other side. It contains a head with a gold coin in its mouth. This is a reference to the ancient Greek tradition of Charon's obol. Greeks would place a coin in the mouths of their deceased to pay Charon for passage across the river Styx. So, on one hand, this is a little Easter egg for Daedalus' labyrinth in Greek mythology, but that's not the only purpose of it. The likely clue here is this represents death, which we'll address again later. Another little side note here, the Dromora is also probably part Easter egg. Daedalus built the labyrinth in those myths to imprison a minotaur. So when we clear the maze, we end up freeing this horned adversary like it's freeing the minotaur from the Greek labyrinth. So that little Easter egg is one layer to this, but that of course is not the whole picture. It's also worth noting that we can actually start the labyrinth by entering from this end. Even though alteration will lead you to destruction is first in the note, we can actually just walk around and start with illusion. But this could just be a development thing, because why make this more complicated than it needs to be? Like, why bother synchronizing them in a specific order when we get the idea? Though we should keep in mind that there may be significance to this. There's also a word wall for dismay at the north end of this canyon. The other word walls for dismay are at Lost Tongue Overlook in the Rift and Dead Crone Rock in the Reach. Interesting how they're both tucked into the southern corners of the map. It's as if they're intentionally really far away from this one. So most of the time, we can't really determine if we're meant to assume that a specific word corresponds to a specific location, because remember, they change based on order of discovery. Since for functional purposes, we need to learn the words in the order that they're actually used in the shout. So the actual dragon script that appears on each word wall depends on how many words for that given shout you've already learned, but it will always be for the same shout. Thus, most of the time we can't determine if the little dragon script blurb on each word wall is actually meant to be there within the context of the lore. However, this time we can, and I'll explain how. The last word of dismay is Mar, and the word wall for it reads, "This stone commemorates the doomed elf children of the Autumn Field, who fled in terror from the sharp swords of the ancient enemy." The only region of Skyrim that one would describe as an Autumn Field is the Rift, so this word wall only really makes sense if it's at Lost Tongue Overlook. The second word is Rue. Here lies the body of Bard Romarius, who tried to run from some goblins but slipped. Goblins don't inhabit Skyrim, but they are known to live in the regions just beyond Skyrim's southwestern border. So this word wall only really makes sense if it's at Dead Crone Rock, since it's right next to the border with Hammerfell. Also, it's built into this ledge of a steep mountain, which someone could conceivably fall off if they were, say, being chased by goblins. So by process of elimination, there's really only one word wall that can make sense here in Labyrinthian. The one for the first word of dismay, Foss, which reads, "Noble Nord, remember these words of the Whorefather. Fear not the specter of death, for he is the herald of glory and your guide to great Sovngarde." Another reference to the cycle of life. Now we're getting somewhere. My friends, my take on the actual maze is that it represents life. It might appear complicated, but it's really just a straight line. You can start with something like Canaan, or nothing like Morgris. And you can go through at any pace you desire, but it does not change the final destination, which is death. So those are my thoughts on the inside of the actual maze. However, there's another dimension to this that often goes overlooked. Instead of sprinting into the alluring maze hoping to find some sort of treasure, let's take a moment and observe our surroundings. Look, stairs. There's an upper level to this canyon that does a whole loop around the labyrinth. This whole area seems to be designed so that we can look at it from above and at different angles. The thing that stands out first and foremost is the hourglass shape referenced in the minor maze. And remember, that was also the answer to Canaan's riddle in Arena. So the concept of an hourglass seems to be important. And what does an hourglass do? It's a tool for measuring a finite amount of time. And is there something else we've discussed that we might describe that way? Yes, life is a finite amount of time. So yeah, there's lots of symbolism at work here. The labyrinth, this hourglass, is a physical tool to help one work their way through a mental endeavor. Well, that sounds a lot like something we've covered having to do with Shalidor, doesn't it? The Path of the Godhead uses the wheel and tower to do this. Also, we've already established that sometimes examining physical representations of concepts having to do with the walking ways can help achieve them. So, I believe that in the same sense that the wheel and tower guard the secrets of the 2nd, 5th, and 6th walking ways, the Labyrinth guards Glamoril, which helps us with the next steps. When it comes to the Path of the Godhead, the wheel and tower are actually the same thing. The tower, or sometimes referred to as the letter I, is the wheel turned on its side. You see, a few steps of the Path of the Godhead involve looking at the wheel from different angles and interpreting them. So, let's apply that here, starting at this platform that looks very specifically designed to be a vantage point. Imagine for a moment that this was a real hourglass. We're used to being level with it, so, it would be oriented like this. But what would happen if you were to take this hourglass and look at it this way? The sand would trickle down. And this is what I believe the true purpose of the items in the shutters is. Nair the sand. When we observe the hourglass from this spot that's obviously designed to be a vantage point, all the items that represent parts of Shalidor's life are in the bottom. The only thing in the top half of the hourglass is Charon's obol, which represents death. So, the only grain of sand that hasn't trickled into the bottom of Shalidor's hourglass, his life, is death. Another subject that comes up with the Path of the Godhead is something called the Secret Triangular Gate, which Vivek says is located in the wheel's center. There seem to be multiple correct interpretations of what this thing is, so I'll go over a few. The walking ways were originally introduced in Morrowind, and the disc or wheel for that game was decorated with the triangular symbol of the Tribunal Temple, and it's right over the center too. It's as close to actually being in the wheel's center as is possible to get. Also, the original Xbox's eject button had the classic eject symbol, with the triangle over the line. But the interpretation relevant for our purposes is that if we connect the dots on the disc reader shape, we end up with a triangle. However, that's not the only thing we can make here. We can also make an arrow. After all, on one of the unused pages in Shalidor's Insights, we see that he is toying with this idea of shapes within shapes. And the labyrinth itself is a path within a shape. So let's keep looking around and see if maybe there are some more shapes at work here. If we connect these dots in the Undercroft, we can once again make a triangle and an arrow. Before I finish the thought here, folks, the reason that I haven't covered this arrow in the past is because there's a big hint for something you can get from this concept that I've been trying to avoid giving out. But there isn't a way around it here, so I figured, why not? But if anyone watching out there ever wants to use this in any sort of official work, like an article or a video, that's you, Nate, then please be sure to credit me and link back to this video. What I'll do is I'll start the thought, but I'll leave the rest up to you. Wolfarth, Zurin Arctis, Tiber Septim, Talos. Now let's get back to this arrow. The whole purpose of arrows is to draw your gaze in a certain direction, right? And isn't there a level to this canyon that's seemingly meant to make it so we can look down upon the maze at different angles? Why, yes, there is. So maybe we ought to take a look at this from up there. It points to the waterfall, and it looks as if water is trickling into this hill formed by the walls of the labyrinth. Or, like sand trickling into the bottom of an hourglass. Which is what would happen if we were to turn the hourglass represented by the labyrinth on its side. And there's more. It trickles just over the spot where the portal takes us to the cellar, which if we go into free camera mode and zoom out, we can see is shaped like the bottom of an hourglass. Alrighty, that's enough suspense. It's time for me to tell you what Glamoril is. My friends, here's what I think the Dreamsleeve was trying to get Shalidor to realize. Glamoril is really quite simple. The secret of life is to enjoy it. Not to spend it obsessing over the specter of death and ways to cheat it, to spend it taking in the world around you, having tons of fun, and most of all, spending all the time you can with the people you love. This is what Shalidor just failed to understand, and that's what the ZeniMax writers really chose to lean into for his story in ESO. They decided to give him a wife named Ulfsild, and through flashbacks and a series of her journals, they told us the story of how they fell in love. and also of the struggles they had in their marriage. First and foremost, how Shalidor's methods of extending his life, which remember the ESO team expanded on, led to disagreements between them. Let's read some passages from Ulfsild's journals to get some perspective. He told me that he knew the secret to life everlasting, and that he wanted to share it with me. Shalidor had offered me eternal life. I said no, of course. How could he have spent a winter with me, talking so closely, and know me so little? We argued at length about his methods. Eternal life, I said? All the time to travel by foot and see the world, and yet you use portals to bypass what wonders you might find along the way? Immortal life, he would argue back? Your accomplishments constrained only by time, and you would spend it plodding from place to place, one foot in front of the other? We had agreed to disagree. I made it clear immortality was anathema to me. I would not prolong my life any more than I would want to prolong summer to stave off winter. The beauty in seasons is always in their passing. Whichever ZeniMax dev wrote this seems to have been very inspired by whatever notes they found in Bethesda's about Shalidor. They've taken that concept of Shalidor missing the point about life and grounded it in this story, and it's very charming. The way I interpret this first line I read is he was asking her to help him finish what he thought Glamoril was, whatever he was trying to get to happen with the shutters and the cellar. Yet Ulfsild was literally giving him Glamoril. She got it. Life is about enjoyment and love. It's about accepting the hourglass, not fighting it. But he was too much of a self-absorbed fool to see it. The closing passage of Ulfsild's third journal seems to vaguely imply that she refused to help Shalidor with his research on Glamoril, and that's part of what led to them going their separate ways. However, as time went on, Ulfsild began to miss him until she realized that she loved Shalidor. So she journeyed to Ivea, where he spent most of his time during that period, hoping to find him. But when she got there, a caretaker informed her that Shalidor had recently departed. Let's keep reading to find out why. Naturally, I inquired where he was away to, as I was hoping to meet with him rather urgently. But such a meeting wouldn't be possible for some time, she said, as he was headed to Skyrim. By boat to High Rock, then on by foot from there. He meant to visit an old friend, she told me, but he hoped to see what other marvels he might find along the way. She told me how long ago he'd left and estimated that he'd probably reach his destination any day now. So Shalidor fell for Ulfsild as well, and he traveled to her in a way that she would approve of. Though of course, when he got there, he realized that she'd left for Ivea. He chose to enjoy the journey, rather than simply save time with a portal. So maybe he was starting to understand what Ulfsild was telling him. But their arguments about him prolonging his lifespan did continue beyond this point. He wished to offer me eternal life so that we might spend it together. I wish to spend my single mortal life as his partner. You might ask yourself, whose wish was the greater show of the love we'd come to share? If we ever come to a consensus on that, I imagine we no longer walk this world together. That's what Shalidor just couldn't fathom, which sadly was part of what led to Ulfsild walking out on him. Life is about what you choose to do with the time you have, not trying to get more. Ulfsild was willing to spend the finite amount of time she had with him, while he obsessed over Ivea and Glamoril. What's the point of living forever if that's how you spend eternity? Let's take another look at what he said to Ulfsild about the concept of a mortal life. Your accomplishments constrained only by time, and you would spend it plodding from place to place, one foot in front of the other? He sought to extend his life so that he might achieve more things, but isn't the whole point of achievement that it leads to happiness? Either for oneself or for benefiting others or the world somehow? Shalidor seems to have been blinded by the endless pursuit of his legacy, or really his ego, and that kept him from the true Glamoril. That's what the Dreamsleeve was trying to show him with the Labyrinth. Nothing he did in the actual maze changed the outcome. The end is always killing the Dremora, which represents death. And looking at it from above, the only grain of sand that hasn't fallen is Charon's obol, which also represents death. The Dreamsleeve was trying to show him that the only thing he had yet to do was die. He'd already faced the Rourken clan, written numerous volumes, protected the Eye of Magnus when he needed to, everything. It was time for him to accept the specter of death and see what lies beyond life. So did Shalidor ever figure it out? Did he eventually get Glamoril right? Well, there's cases to be made for both. Like we said in the beginning, we know that he had ways of extending his life, yet he did eventually die. There's no record of him being slain in any sort of great battle or any mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. So if his death wasn't some grand, noteworthy event, then how did he go? I'm inclined to think that he chose to die. He probably stopped going to Bromjunaar Sanctuary and just fell asleep one night and didn't wake up. Also, when asked about his biggest regret in the SO, he responds that he wishes he had spent more time teaching. The much more obvious answer there is that he regrets losing Ulfsild, so why isn't that his biggest regret? Maybe because they reunited in the afterlife, so it all worked out in the end. So that's the case to be made that he did figure it out eventually. Now here's the case to be made that he didn't. These two bits of dialogue from ESO suggest that he still views Glamoril as a physical thing, not an idea. I began work on a powerful artifact, a key to the inner workings of life itself, Glamoril. But that's neither here nor there. The point is I reached a critical juncture where even my knowledge and power failed me. I needed more. And also this one. What are you most proud of? You might as well ask a parent which is their favorite child. So many of my little projects became legend. Ivea, Labyrinthian, the Great Ice Fortress of Winterhold, and Glamoril of course, but I do go on. Though it's important that we keep in mind that these lines are intentionally very vague, so as not to give us too many clues about Glamoril. Also, if he accepted the folium from Sheogorath because he thought it would help him finish this physical artifact that he calls Glamoril, and it turned out to be a trick, then doesn't it follow that he never finished this artifact that he believed was Glamoril? And if that's the case, then he's probably just referring to his extended research on Glamoril when he's talking about things he's known for. After all, if a NASA scientist were talking about something they were working on, like say a space elevator, well there is no completed space elevator, but if they were lecturing about it, that's still what they would call it, right? Also, the way the line is actually written in the subtitles with these ... makes me think that the writer's original intention may have been for the voice actor to change tone a little bit when he reached that point in the sentence. Like maybe the idea was for him to say it more like this. And Glamoril, of course. But I do go on. Which would suggest that maybe he's recalling all the suffering he endured as a result of his obsession with Glamoril. Moving on, there's a theory that some fans propose that we should talk about here. There's a case to be made that the man we meet in the SO isn't really Shalidor. The little blops of magic that surround him in the SO are purple, a color that tends to be more associated with things like conjuration and soul gems rather than what we'll call the ethereal magics, which tend to be a light blue. So from that we could suggest something like maybe the Shalidor we meet is a vestige, like the player character from ESO. Another direction we could go in here is that maybe this isn't Shalidor at all, but rather an imposter made by Sheogorath for the purpose of roping us into his little game. After all, he never really has to give Ivea back, does he? Yet he chooses to. So is the whole Mages Guild questline just Uncle Sheo having some fun? It is fitting for the character. After all, one of the quests, Circus of Cheerful Slaughter, is him showing us some of the misfortune he caused by seizing Ivea. Furthermore, he uses magic to make actors for that quest, including one for Shalidor, so we know that he can make Shalidor imposters. So perhaps the whole questline is really just him entertaining himself like he does in that quest. So which is right? Did Shalidor ever figure Glamoril out, or is he forever doomed to his own vices, endlessly pursuing more achievements for no apparent reason? Well, I for one am not really more convinced of one case versus the other, so for the time being, I'm going with the pragmatic approach and choosing the ending to Shalidor's story that I like better. I'll go with he did eventually get it, then he chose to die so that he could be with his beloved Ulfsild in the afterlife. And the Shalidor we meet in the SO is simply one of Sheogorath's doppelgangers. The version of the story where Shalidor and Ulfsild lose each other forever makes me sad, so I'm choosing the other one. Now let's revisit the definition of Glamoril. It means secret of life in Elvish. Many traditional elves have a very negative view of mortality. This is especially common among the Altmer of the Somerset Isles, so maybe part of what the devs are going for here is that Shalidor's making the same mistake that those elves do in viewing mortality as such a terrible thing. So they thought it would be fitting for him to use an elven word for his misguided attempts to cheat death. And how did Shalidor steal Glamoril from Akatosh? Well, we're pretty sure that Shalidor got the design for the Labyrinth, which guards Glamoril, by seeing it via the Dreamsleeve, which may mean that he saw the finished one in the future. So maybe the idea is that's like stealing from Akatosh because he's the god of time. However, I do have an additional idea for you. Remember earlier when I was saying that the Labyrinth is like a laboratory experiment and that Shalidor may think that he's repeating someone else's experiments? Well, maybe, just maybe, that is the case and that someone else is Akatosh. Or is a being that's at least Akatosh adjacent. You see, Akatosh is the Alessian version of what's called the Dragon God. So the Dragon God in lore is, there's Akatosh, there's Alduin, there's Auriel, like all these different cultures have their own Dragon God. And this specific one, Akatosh, is commonly theorized to be Alessia's attempt at uniting her empire under one religion by combining the elven dragon god, Auriel, with the mankind missing god, Shor. And that dichotomy of Dragon God and Missing God actually has basis in the creation story of Elder Scrolls. Each of those two beings that turn up in every Elder Scrolls religion are derived from the original two beings of the universe, Anu and Padome. And really they were more primordial forces than beings. And it's said that where these two forces meet is called the Arbus. And the Arbus is described in a number of different ways, but it's always the gray area between the two forces. And the definition that's relevant for our purposes is it's sometimes called the gray area between is and is not. Eventually, new gods formed in the Arbus and made Mundus, which is the mortal realm, and within that is the planet Nirn. So how is this relevant to Shalidor stealing from Akatosh? Well, this creation story can be represented by the Labyrinth. Each half of the hourglass could be Anu and Padome, the cellar could be the Arbus, and the Dremora could be Mundus. So maybe, just maybe, this claim that Shalidor stole Glamoril from Akatosh is derived from how he kinda copied the creation story. And Akatosh is just a being that it makes sense to cite there because, he's kind of a combination of those original two forces. It is very fitting that the cellar would represent either the Arbus or Mundus because it's defined by its impermanence. You see, this creation process is a cycle. You may have heard the term Kalpic cycle in my videos before. Yeah, it's like your creation starts, it ends with Alduin eating the world, then it starts again. So that's kind of like the cellar, isn't it? Someone happens by, they clear the maze, the cellar opens, they kill the Dremora, and that's it. And then eventually someone else happens along, they clear the maze, and do it all again. Another thing I want to make sure to bring up here is that we can ground the Kalpic cycle in terms of an hourglass. Maybe rather than eat the world, Alduin flips over the hourglass every time it runs out. So yeah, those are my thoughts on how Shalidor may have stolen Glamoril from Akatosh. One more closing thought here. Remember that shout from Old Knocker that Shalidor was hoping to learn? What happens when you shake the dragon just so? Well, given that Wulfarth used it to adjust his people's lifespans, shaking the dragon probably symbolizes that adjustment, which makes sense given the association between dragons and time in this universe. But what else can you use to symbolize time? An hourglass. And what could you manage to do if you were to say shake an hourglass just so? You could prevent the sand from falling down, as in prevent the time from expiring. So what Wulfarth did is he shook the hourglasses of his people's lives until the sand was right back where it was prior to Alduin's meddling. So Shalidor wanted to learn that shout so that he could shake his hourglass. Well, that, my friends, is a wrap. A very, very long wrap. Those are all of Shalidor's most well-kept secrets. Thank you all so much for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you think I've earned it. And please share this video all over Reddit, Discord, and whatever else you have to make sure the whole fanbase gets a chance to see it, because I'm really proud of this one. And a lot of services like that have rules about creators posting their own content, but people other than the creators can post it wherever they want. So yeah, please post away in Discords, Reddits, whatever you got. Also, if you like short-form content as well, then I do this little trivia of the day game on these platforms, including my YouTube Shorts channel, The Black Rose Courier. And last but not least, I am still fundraising for the Alzheimer's Association. Alzheimer's is such a terrible disease, and this association does a lot for people that suffer from it. So if you'd like to support the cause, or you just want to find out more, the link in the description is the place for you to go. Well, that's about it for this one. By the way, the next Fan Fury video actually isn't going to be that far away, because I've actually already written most of it. Well, to close out, I want to be sure to thank Nate again. Thank you so much for joining me on this one, Nate. It was an honor to work with you, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I will see you next time.